Good morning. The only reason that I feel comfortable telling you the following story is because it's now all out in the open. Okay, everyone knows it now. There's no longer any sort of an issue of confidentiality. But a few weeks ago, I could not have told this story. When we worked for a church in Texas before moving here 2 years ago, there was an older couple that was at the church that Rachel and I got really close to. We loved these people dearly. They're right about 60 years old, and they're just awesome people. Whenever Rachel and I first got here, we remarked on multiple occasions that if we could have brought one family from Texas with us when we moved to Georgia, it would have been this family. The wife in this family is one of the most spiritually mature people I have ever met. She was the one that kept up the prayer list for the entire church. She was the first person that people would call when they had a need. I don't know how many times she was the one that would tell me, now David, so-and-so over here is hurting. We need to go visit them and take care of them. She was awesome. I often half joked that we should make her an elder. And I was only half joking. She would have been fantastic as an elder. The husband in this couple was one of my favorite people in the world to hang out with. He was my golfing buddy. We played basketball together, we played cards, we did all kinds of stuff together. In fact, the one person that Luke always asked about after we moved was this guy. It's like, when do we get to see this guy again? When can we go see him? This was the family that most came to visit us in the hospital when we were going through all of Luke's stuff. In fact, I still remember once when Luke had just had a surgery, we were at the point where we could take him around in a little red wagon around the hospital, and we were down in the food court when this couple came in, and Luke saw this man, and his eyes just lit up, and he called out to him across the food court. We loved this family. I would literally give anything for this family. Well, a couple of months ago, we saw a prayer request on Facebook to pray for their marriage. And Rachel and I talked about it and said, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, there has to be some kind of misunderstanding. Surely what we saw on Facebook was her putting a prayer request for someone that's a friend of theirs or something else. It can't be about the two of them. Well, Rachel called the lady and ended up crying with her for about an hour. In her tears, she said she didn't know if she had a marriage left. Well, the next day I called the husband, my friend, my golfing buddy, and he told me the whole story. About a year ago, he met a girl. He met her while playing in a church volleyball league. Okay, and you keep in mind that he's about 60 years old. She's about 21, 22. And as a new adult, she needed help doing some things, like she was moving from her apartment into a house, and he would help her move. He helped her fix up things in her new house. They started out just being friends with each other. Eventually, they fell in love and started sleeping together. Ultimately, they couldn't keep it a secret. Well, this man has a son who's in college, who's only 3 years younger than this girl. This man's wife has struggled with her health. And my friend was on the phone talking to me. He said, David, I've lost my family, and I don't know how to fix it. I never meant for this to happen. I talked with him for a while. I prayed with him, and yet the damage is done. This was just a couple of months ago, and where it sits today, I don't know that he'll ever get back to what he had. I don't know that he will ever get his wife back. I don't know that he will ever have a healthy relationship with his son, who's now gone off to college. This man's gone forward to his church. He's repented of his sin. He's received lots of prayers. But there's some sins that we can repent for the sin. We can say, Lord, I'm sorry. We can fall to our knees and we can say all the right things and promise I will never go back to that sin. And yet the damage is done and we can't fix all that damage. This morning, we continue our sermon series on sex and sexuality. And today we talk about the sin of adultery. All right, I want to give you a definition for adultery. I think adultery is a sexual relationship in which at least one of the people is married to someone else. Okay, this is what I mean when I say adultery. There's other sexual sins that the Bible addresses. There's things like premarital sex or homosexuality, some other things that we will talk about later on in this sermon series in the next few weeks. But the specific sin of adultery is when we are breaking marriage vows by one of the people involved in this relationship being married to someone else. And this morning, there is an easy way to preach this sermon, and there's a hard way to preach this sermon. Okay, the easy way to do this, the easy way to have a sermon on adultery is to go to the Bible and go to a bunch of texts that condemn adultery. And I can tell you a bunch of sad stories about people that we've known before, like my friend from Texas who's messed up his marriage, messed up his whole life because of his adultery. Undoubtedly, after reading these texts and going through these stories, I would have everyone here agreeing with me that adultery is both sinful and extremely damaging. I mean, anyone on the opposite side of that right now? Or we all agree this is a sin, right? Okay. I mean, after all, the Bible is not ambiguous about this at all. Okay, Exodus chapter 20, commandment number 7 out of the Big Ten, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 22, later on, God tells the people of Israel, he says, if you catch someone in the sin of adultery, what you do is you drag them to the city gate, everyone picks up rocks, throws the rocks at them until they're dead. Okay, penalty for adultery is death. You say, well, that's all Old Testament stuff, preacher. We're under the new law, new covenant, right? Okay, what about Matthew chapter 5? Jesus, Sermon on the Mount, he says, it is better to gouge out your eyes than to even think about adultery. Okay, immediately after that, he says the one reason that it might be okay to get a divorce, okay, and by the way, God hates divorce, but the reason that it might be okay to get a divorce is if your spouse has been unfaithful to you. Adultery will ruin your marriage. Okay, and the easy way to preach this sermon is we could go through a bunch of texts like this. We could break them down. I could give you different Greek and Hebrew words to make me sound really smart about it. I could give you some good stories that illustrate it. 3 points later, we could all go home feeling really bad for all those poor, sinful people who get caught up in adultery. We'll just bless their hearts. Isn't that terrible? And yet, even though that's the easy sermon, I don't think that sermon is the most helpful way for us to talk about adultery this morning. And part of the reason why I don't think that's the most helpful sermon is because my friend from Texas who cheated on his wife with his 20-something girlfriend could have quoted that sermon to you. In fact, when I preached that sermon on adultery 3 years ago in Texas, he was sitting in the audience. So I want to preach this sermon in a little bit more of a difficult way. What I would like for us to do with the rest of our time this morning is I want us to spend a few minutes talking about how affairs happen. Talk about what we can do about it. How can we protect our marriages against adultery? Because it's one thing for us to think, yeah, this is wrong, this is sinful, we all know that. It's another thing altogether for us to learn how to protect ourselves from falling to the temptation. All right, here's number one. And if you only write one thing down this morning, please write this on the front of your bulletin. Think about this. Is that adultery happens as a result of unfulfilled needs. Okay, affairs happen as a result of unfulfilled needs. A lot of places we could go in Scripture to find this, but I'm going to read us a passage from Proverbs chapter 7. Okay, and for the most part, the book of Proverbs is filled with these little 2-line pithy sayings telling us some generic lesson on how to be wise, right? Like, work hard and you'll prosper. If you be lazy, you'll suffer, okay? And it's stuff like that, real generic kind of advice. But right in the middle of the book of Proverbs, for a chapter and a half, we have a long extended discourse on the folly of adultery. Okay, notice the word of the Lord, Proverbs chapter 7. It says, at the window of my house, I looked down through the lattice. I saw among the simple, I noticed among the young men a youth who had no sense. He was going down the street near her corner, walking along in the direction of her house at twilight as the day was fading, as the dark of night set in. Then out came a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute and with crafty intent. She is unruly and defiant. Her feet never stay at home. Now in the street, now in the squares. At every corner she lurks. She took hold of him and kissed him, and with a brazen face she said, "Today I have fulfilled my vows, and I have food for my fellowship offering at home. So I came out to meet you. I looked for you and have found you. I have covered my bed with colored linens from Egypt. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let's drink deeply of love till morning. Let's enjoy ourselves with love. My husband is not at home. He is gone on a long journey. He took his purse filled with money and will not be home till full moon." With persuasive words, she led him astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk. All right, notice all of the things that this crafty woman offers this youth with no sense. Okay, it says she offers him choice meat left over from the fellowship offering. "Come back to my house, I'll feed you this warm meal." She offers him exotic sex with the perfumes and the special sheets. She mentions her husband is gone for a long time. She's telling him no one will know. This will just be between us. Finally, verse 18, she offers him love. Come, let us enjoy ourselves with love. I talked to my wife a lot about this sermon because she's a marriage and family therapist. I did some research on this. It turns out that the reason that people often have affairs is not because they're trying to ruin a marriage. It's not because they're trying to be selfish. Most of the time, affairs just sort of happen because people aren't actively guarding against it. People sort of wake up one day involved in this relationship with someone else, and it got to a point they never thought it would get. But regardless of whether an affair is premeditated or spontaneous, people fall into this temptation because they think that this is a place where we can meet some need that's not being fulfilled somewhere else in our life. People get into affairs to meet needs. I'm certainly no expert on this. Okay, but research indicates that men and women tend to have affairs for different reasons. Okay, and I'm about to show you a list of men and women's needs. Don't push this too far, okay? These are all generalities. All of us have lots of needs, and it's a little bit different for every person, but in general terms, men and women tend to approach their basic needs a little bit differently. I want us to talk about what those are this morning. Okay, women's biggest needs tend to be affection, conversation, and openness. Okay, what a woman wants more than anything is intimacy and emotional connection with her partner, okay, with her spouse. A woman would rather talk than do just about anything else. Okay, I'll share this story with you. I shouldn't share this with you because it could easily get me in trouble, but again, forgiveness is always easier than permission, right? So I'll go ahead and share this with you. She gave me a look, so I wasn't sure what to do with that, but we'll proceed. I'm too far into it now. The other day, it had been a couple days since Rachel and I had really gotten to connect. She'd been working in the evenings, and I'd been doing a lot during the days, and we'd just been missing each other, and so for about 2 days, we just hadn't seen each other at all. Okay, so one night after about 2 days of this, we sat down and just talked for about an hour straight. Okay, no cell phones, no TV on. We just had a conversation with each other, looking each other in the eye. We talked for like an hour solid. The next day, she says to me, she goes, "David, man, it felt like we just really made love last night." I was like, that makes one of us, right? It is what it is, right? But women need that, right? They need that connection. They need that emotional connection. They want affection. They want conversation, openness, the intimacy that comes from that emotional connection with each other. Okay, I think men are wired a little bit differently. You laugh, but it's true, right? Okay, here's men's biggest needs. Okay, sex. Okay, men also need respect. All right, a man wants more than anything to feel like his wife respects him. Right? Men also want to achieve a sense of accomplishment. In fact, while most women will judge the success of their life based on how many friendships and good relationships they have, most men will base their success in life on how many things they've accomplished. How many jobs I've done successfully, how many degrees I have on my wall, how many deals I closed at work, whatever it is. Okay? We judge our success differently. Also on men's biggest needs list is sex. Okay? That's intentional, by the way. Nearly 60% of men who have an affair respond that they are happy in their marriage. The majority of people who end up having an affair are happy with their marriage. Okay, it's not always about being unhappy at home. Often it's about seeing that one of the needs on this list can be met by someone else. And then you start feeling like, this person really gets me. Then they, quote, fall in love. And the next thing you know, we're in an affair. All right, let me give you a scenario that's happened in churches very often. In fact, it's happened so often in churches that now they warn us about this very extensively in seminary. Okay, I think probably 10 times while I was in seminary, I heard the following story told to me by my professors telling me, don't do this. Okay, but here's what happens. Okay, a woman goes to her preacher for counseling. Or maybe it's even just a conversation at church with him about the problems that she's having at home. Okay, her husband is a good guy, but he works a lot. He hasn't been very attentive to her when he is at home. He's under a lot of stress. There's a lot of other things going on. And so she gets to unload all of her struggles onto this preacher. Well, suddenly this preacher, who's always well-dressed, who at least appears to be confident, appears to have his act all put together, he starts listening to her because he's paid to listen to her, right? And he's a good guy. And he starts caring for her needs in a way that she hasn't felt in a long time. Well, soon she feels like she can talk to this man in a way that she hasn't talked to her husband ever since they started dating. This preacher understands her. So she starts telling this preacher how great he is. She starts feeding his sense of accomplishment. And even though he's happy at home, suddenly he has a woman here in front of him who needs him, who has great respect for him, who tells him how much greater he is than her husband. Soon they both feel like the only person that really understands them is each other. Next thing you know, they're in love. And come on, doesn't God want us to be happy? Next thing that happens is you form a search committee to hire a new preacher, right? And everyone's wondering, how could this possibly happen to these Christians who are supposed to be committed to their marriages? And of course, you can insert any other number of people into that story and get the same conclusion, right? 2 co-workers, a businessman and his secretary, 2 neighbors who are having coffee together. Whoever else you want to put into the story, you can get the same story. When we start going outside of our marriages to get these needs met, we end up in ungodly relationships that we never intended. Okay, for some of us this morning, we need to think really hard about what our needs are. Okay, you need to know what your primary needs are in your relationship. You need to know what your spouse's primary needs are. It's going to be just a little bit different for different people. Again, these are generalities that I've got on the board behind me. But we need to know what the needs are in our relationship and ask ourselves if we need to work harder on our marriages to make sure that we have our needs met at home and don't start looking for them outside of our home. Does that all make sense? All right, I am dogmatic that your best friend should not be someone of the opposite sex. Unless it's maybe your sibling. Okay, you could do that. You can get away with that one. But other than that, your friends, your closest friends, cannot be people of the opposite sex. As a couple, you can have couple friends that you're really close to. But a man and a woman cannot be just really good friends together if either of them is married. There is no such thing as harmless flirting either. Fair enough? All right, so some questions that are worth asking as we do have relationships with people of the opposite sex, because that is unavoidable, right? We're going to run into people of the opposite sex, but we can ask ourselves some questions to ask ourselves, are we going down a dangerous road? Okay, the first question you can ask yourself is, how personal do I let these conversations get with this person? Okay, there's a lot of stuff we shouldn't talk about with people that are not our spouse. And it's one thing to have, some close buddies that are your same sex that you can talk to about stuff, and that's okay. But you can't have that person be someone of the opposite sex. That's just not okay. Second thing is, do I usually only share negative details about my marriage or my spouse? If I'm constantly going to work and proclaiming to the girl that's working next to me, well, here's all the stuff that's wrong with my wife, that's a problem. Okay, and number 3 is, do we sometimes speak with sexual innuendo? Okay, be careful about that as we have conversations, especially with people of the opposite sex. It just leads to dangerous places. Okay, so number 1, affairs happen as a result of unfulfilled needs. We think we can go outside of our marriage and get these other needs fulfilled, and it takes us to a dangerous place. All right, number 2. Affairs have drastic consequences. There was another couple from the church where we were at in Texas, a young couple this time, right about our own age, in which she decided that her husband wasn't making her happy any longer. And since God wants us to be happy, it was okay for her to have a boyfriend. So she starts an affair with this guy, and she files for divorce against her husband. Well, they had 2 little girls, 2 precious, very cute, elementary-aged girls, right about the age 5 and 8, somewhere in that area. And she was shocked when her husband said to her, "You know what, dear, I'm getting custody of the girls because they're as much mine as they are yours. You're the one who's proven that you can't be trusted. Also, honey, I'm the one that has the job. You don't have a job. And I need all of the money I'm making in order to provide for the girls that I'm going to fight for custody of, because you're the one who's proven that you can't be trusted. You haven't had a job, you haven't held a job in years. Also, since I have the money and the kids, I'm keeping the house. Because again, you're the one that's proven you can't be trusted." Well, the woman was devastated. Okay, and he actually succeeded in getting most of that. She wasn't ready to fight for her girl. She certainly wasn't ready to try and live on her own with no job. And this woman's quest to find happiness, she's ended up with no kids, no husband, no house, no job. She is in the hardest place she's ever been in her life. And this was all because she was trying to find true happiness. Because after all, doesn't God want us to be happy? Okay, this is the same story that sin always tells us. We see this shiny momentary pleasure and we think, if I could just grab this one pleasurable thing, if I could just make an exception, because after all, it's in my own best interest, right, to get this one thing that will make me happy. If I could just pursue that one thing, I can still keep everything else in my life whole, and I can get that one thing, and then everything will be great. And yet sin always, after the momentary pleasure is gone, we face long-term consequences. Hear Proverbs chapter 6, because he tells us this is what happens. He says, "Can a man scoop fire into his lap without his clothes being burned? Can a man walk on hot coals without his feet being scorched? So is he who sleeps with another man's wife. No one who touches her will go unpunished. People do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his hunger when he is starving. Yet if he is caught, he must pay 7-fold, though it costs him all the wealth of his house. But a man who commits adultery has no sense. Whoever does so destroys himself. Blows and disgrace are his lot, and his shame will never be wiped away. For jealousy arouses a husband's fury, and he will show no mercy when he takes revenge. He will not accept any compensation. He will refuse a bribe, however great it is." Okay, so Proverbs says there's consequences for your sins, but different sins have different consequences. You get caught stealing, there's things you can do to go back and try to make that right. Okay, you can do your jail time, you can give back what you stole, you can make restitution to the person you stole it from. If you steal someone's goat, you can go pay him the value of the goat, and the person will forgive you and get over it. He says the consequences for adultery, though, are much deeper, because you don't just go and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, here, let me make it right." There's no walking that one back. Forgiveness is much harder, and it is a sin that will follow you. Notice Proverbs 7:24. He says, "Now then, my sons, listen to me. Pay attention to what I say. Do not let your heart turn to her ways or stray into her paths. Many are the victims she has brought down. Her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death." Okay, the consequences to adultery are much deeper than those of most other sins. Okay, the first casualty in adultery is trust. I saw this picture on the internet. I thought that was pretty appropriate. Okay, adultery kills trust. In fact, it's often emotionally easier to lose a spouse to death than it is to adultery. And what happens is often people get into affairs thinking, well, this new person is going to make me happy. Okay, and this will be the spouse I always wanted. But what happens when you take two adulterous people and then you put them together in a marriage, now you've got two people married to each other that really can't trust each other. You've taken two people from dysfunctional relationships, put them into a new, completely dysfunctional marriage, and it's not going to work. There was a recent study done by the University of Chicago that discovered that a third of all marriages end in divorce because of an affair. And when you put the person who gets married to the person they had an affair with, the divorce rate approaches 80%. You're not going to run off with your mistress, get married, and have this wonderful relationship that you always wanted. The problems that you had in your first marriage, you're going to take those with you right into your second one. Only now you don't have any trust to build on. There's a lot more we could say about this. We could study the life of King David. 2 Samuel 11 would be a good place to go. It's a good story because we see that even though God forgave David for his sin of adultery, even though David repented fully, even though he fell to his knees and said, "God, what have I done? Please forgive me," there were consequences that still haunted David for the rest of his life. Okay? Adultery has drastic consequences. But I don't want to leave us there this morning. I want to leave us with number 3. Finally this morning is that adultery can be forgiven. Okay? Affairs can be forgiven. While affairs have drastic consequences, we need to remember that the power of Jesus is stronger than any sin, including the sin of adultery. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 11, Paul goes through a lot of sins, and he goes through the Corinthian sin problem, and he says, some of you are murderers, some of you are liars, some of you are adulterers, some of you are all these different things, and he lists out all the worst sins he can think of. And after he lists out all of these sins, including adultery, he ends by saying, and that is what some of you were. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. Even adultery can be forgiven because the power of Jesus is more powerful than any sin we can commit. I already told you 2 stories of affairs from Texas. I want to close with one more. Not that everyone in the church at Texas was involved in an affair. It's just there were at least 3 of them that I can tell you about. This one actually happened before I got there, but the guy in Texas who became a really close friend of mine, a guy about my own age, before I met him, he had an affair on his wife. Okay, he had a girlfriend. Eventually it came out his wife left him. He repented. He recognized this was a terrible thing to do. He moved away from that girlfriend, moved to a different state entirely, kept in contact with his wife, kept providing for her needs as best he could, tried as hard as he could to be a good husband and father to her. Eventually, she came back to him. They got some counseling. They worked on rebuilding their trust. They worked very diligently on their marriage. It took several years, but they now have a beautiful family that functions well together. They had more children together. He even eventually became a leader in the church after going through all of these things. My wife tells me that it takes about 7 years for trust to happen after an affair. It takes about 7 years for a couple that wants to make it work after an affair to rebuild trust and get back to the level of trust that they had before the affair started. Again, I think that is a testimony to the power of forgiveness, a testimony to the power of Jesus Christ to make all things new, including our deepest sins. So I do want to leave you with the thought that whatever sins you have, the power of Jesus is more powerful than the worst sin you can imagine, and that Jesus died for all of us as sinners, and that even though some of us may not have this particular sin in our bag, we've got others that Jesus also had to die for. We have other ways in which we have failed our spouses, other ways in which we need to continue to reevaluate, am I truly putting my spouse first? Am I truly seeking to meet their needs? Am I truly going to my spouse to have my needs met? We need to have strong marriages, and I think that's one of the ways that we witness to the world the power of Jesus Christ. At this time in our service, we're going to sing a few verses of an invitation song. During the singing of this song, I will be down front. One of our shepherds will be down front. We would love the opportunity to pray with you or talk to you about anything that's going on in your life. We as the church long to be here for you. If you have a need, please come forward now while we stand and while we sing.